World War II, the world was divided not by physical borders, but by two very different ideas. These ideas would lead to a new kind of conflict known as the Cold War. The Cold War lasted nearly 50 years and was a time of tension, distrust, and the constant fear of nuclear war. At the heart of the Cold War were two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. The US stood for democracy and capitalism, while the Soviet Union represented communism and a government that controlled everything. These two systems were very different and they didn't get along. After World War II, Europe was in ruins and countries were trying to rebuild. But instead of working together, the US and the Soviet Union started to distrust each other. The Soviet Union, led by Joseph Stalin, wanted to spread communism across Europe and beyond. The US, on the other hand, feared this spread because communism did not allow freedom and democracy. In 1946, Winston Churchill, the former leader of Britain, said that an iron curtain had fallen across Europe, separating the communist East from the democratic West. This division marked the start of the Cold War. As tensions grew, the US and the Soviet Union formed alliances. The US and several Western European countries created NATO, that is, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to defend democracy and stop the spread of communism. In 1955, the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact with its allies in Eastern Europe like Poland and East Germany. One of the most dangerous parts of the Cold War was the arms race. Both the US and the Soviet Union built up huge amounts of nuclear weapons, each trying to have more than the other. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb, making the world even more afraid of what could happen. This led to a terrifying situation called mutually assured destruction. It meant that if one country launched nuclear weapons, the other would respond and both would be destroyed. The Cold War wasn't fought on battlefields, but in the air with spies and through massive amounts of weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 was the most dangerous moment of the Cold War. The Soviet Union placed missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US. This put American cities directly in danger. For 13 tense days, President John F. Kennedy and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev negotiated to avoid war. Finally, the Soviets agreed to remove the missiles, and the US promised not to invade Cuba. While the US and the Soviet Union never fought each other directly, they fought in other countries. These are called proxy wars. They used smaller nations as battlegrounds to fight for influence over the world's future. The Korean War and Vietnam War were major proxy wars. These wars happened all over the world in places like Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Every conflict was part of the bigger Cold War struggle between the US and the Soviet Union. By the 1980s, the Cold War was beginning to wind down. The Soviet Union, under leader Mikhail Gorbachev, made changes to try to fix the country's problems. He introduced glasnost to allow more freedom of speech and perestroika to make the economy more efficient. But the Soviet Union was struggling. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, which separated East and West Germany, was torn down. In 1991, the Soviet Union itself fell apart. The Cold War was officially over. The Cold War had ended, but the world had changed. The two powerful ideologies that once dominated global politics were no longer the driving forces. While the Cold War was fought with ideas, weapons, and secret operations, its legacy still influences our world today. The Cold War reminds us that sometimes the biggest dangers don't come from battles, but from the way ideas shape the future. It teaches us that fear and distrust can create long-lasting divisions, and that dialogue and understanding are key to avoiding conflict. Before we wrap up, here's a question for you. What event brought the US and the Soviet Union closest to a nuclear war during the Cold War? The Korean War, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, or the Berlin Blockade? Send the answer to this question in the comment section, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.